What is going on? Welcome back to yet another episode of Shiz Gaming Reviews. Now, one question that I am commonly asked almost all the time is, Larry, what is your all-time favorite console? Well, to answer your question, if I had to say, out of all the consoles that exist, that if I had to say which one in particular is my favorite, I would definitely go with the Sony PlayStation. The Sony PlayStation, the original, in my opinion, is the greatest game console of all time. It was the first video game console to sell over 100 million units worldwide, and it received a lot of mainstream success and is the home of some of the greatest video games of all time. It's widely regarded as one of the greatest consoles of all time, and personally, it's my favorite of all time. I've had so many nostalgic memories with this system that I could literally recount them in one video, maybe in a two-part video, but that would be a completely different video altogether. So today we're just going to mainly focus on just talking about the console itself and some of the games that I think are the best on there, some of my personal favorites, and give you a recommendation. So with that being said, let's begin the review. First thing that we want to discuss is obviously the console design. You can clearly see that it's a pretty huge, it's a pretty huge console. It's not as big as the Sega Saturn, not as heavy as the Sega Saturn either. But you can clearly see that, obviously it's like a rectangle kind of shape and all that stuff, whereas the Sega Saturn was more like square, you know what I mean? And then it's got like this giant, this giant circle around there, obviously showcasing the disc tray, which is where you would obviously insert your games. Now, this particular model that I have is the model SCPH7501. It's one of the later models where after Sony fixed major issues with the disk drive, that was one of the many issues that the PlayStation had when it first came out. And it's a common theme with a lot of the consoles too from Sony, which was that they've always had issues like reading discs after a while. Like eventually they break down, like most infamously the SCPH1001 model, which is the earliest one. And the only difference too is that the laser is placed on a different side of the PlayStation, but this one in particular, the laser is placed on another side. You see, the thing about the PlayStation 2 is that it's very, very affordable as well. You can literally go to any retro gaming video game store and they're only charging like what, $20 for it. I only got mine for like $25, and that included the DualShock controller too. So it's very, very affordable. So anyway, let's move on. In the front, you can see that there are two controller ports with two memory card slots. Now, as I said before, you can also get a multi-tap, which I will tell you right now, the multi-tap for this console is amazing. The PlayStation 1 multi-tap in particular looks like this. And you can kind of see it's almost like shaped like a boomerang, like you could just kind of like throw it like a boomerang and whatnot. But it's really good. So all you have to do is just plug it into the first port, and then it just works for all. It works for all four controllers. The only thing is though is that as far as memory card slots go, I'm not 100% sure how that works because it seems to only work for the first memory card slot instead of the others. Now I'm not sure if they do increase the overall size of the memory card for it, but I'm not sure. So you guys are gonna have to consult more experts on that because I unfortunately don't know. So yeah, that's the front, and then when you go to the back, you can see that this little parallel port right here. What this does is that you can actually insert like a Gameshark kind of plug-in into it, which would allow you to like cheat on your games and whatnot. But I know this was taken off of much later models, like the 9000 models, because I guess people didn't really use it all that much, so they took it off, I guess for costs, for cost reasons, I suppose. And right over here you have your serial output, which is the port that you use to link your PS1 with another PlayStation 1, and then on the other side you have your obvious AV cable, which as again, if you've watched my Sega Saturn console review, you already know that I use the HDMI level height cables for the PlayStation 1, which upscales the console to a 720p HD resolution so I can play in HD clarity and record it on my Elgato, which is the footage that I always use a lot, and I even live stream them too. Then on the other hand, you also have your power supply, your power slot, which much like the Sega Saturn, it does have a built-in power supply, which is why it's pretty heavy, because it does have a built-in power supply, which is really, really awesome. I feel like a lot of video game consoles should have that. And now we are going to move on to another fun segment, which is the controllers. But before we do, allow me to point out about the memory cards, which is that you can actually get them in a variety of different colors and stuff of that nature and all that stuff. You can also easily buy brand new PS1 memory cards. There's still new PS1 memory cards still being made to this day. You can easily go on to Amazon and buy them for a couple bucks and all that stuff, and they're Amazon Prime eligible, which is great. But I do have 4 memory cards in my collection as well. 2 of which are officially licensed by Sony, whereas the ones on the other hand are third party. But the third party ones are still pretty good, but I don't think they have as much good built quality as the original. But the third party memory cards are still really good to have. I would definitely still have them in the collection. Now, with that being said, we are going to be moving on to the controllers. So the first one that we are going to talk about is the original controller that came with the console, which is the non-analog PlayStation controller. This is a very classic controller. It's very light. It's very lightweight, and it's a really good controller. Obviously, by today's standards, people obviously wouldn't praise this controller as much, but I will say right now that I still think that this is one of the best controllers ever, because it does play very well and it fits right into your hands very, very well. It's it's very comfortable to hold in your hands, and all that stuff. It's not as big and hefty as the DualShock controller, but it still does the job. You can obviously see that there's your D-pad. You can see there's your D-pad, then there's your select button, and then there's your start button as well. And then you have the famous triangle, square, X, and circle buttons, all of which have been well documented in the video gaming business. And then on the top, you have 4 buttons on the top of the controller, which is unlike any other controller, because they usually just have a left trigger and a right trigger. I mean, this controller does too, but in the form of L2 or R2, because it has shoulder buttons. It was the first, I believe this was the first console of its kind to actually introduce the shoulder buttons, while also having, little triggers as well, like the R2 and the L2 buttons. So yeah, that's why I really love this controller so much. It's really awesome. And as an amazing sequel to this controller, Sony would later go on to make a new controller that would appeal to other games that were released for the system that would utilize analog control. And so that would result in the invention of the DualShock, the famous DualShock controller. This is the controller that everybody loves. Probably hands down the best video game controller of all time. It's so recognizable. In my opinion, I do think that the DualShock controller is the greatest video game controller of all time. It's super duper comfortable. It has nice build quality. It's just an amazing controller. Much like the original controller, you obviously still have your buttons and your D-pad and your start and select and all that stuff. But if you also look at the top, you can see that the triggers actually look like actual triggers this time, because they're actually pretty big this time. And obviously you can see that there is your analog sticks, which also act as a button too, because when you press on them like this, they count as L3 or R3. So the fact that they added additional buttons, which actually do sometimes work in certain games, is really, really cool. There's even a little analog button right here, right at the bottom of the select and the start button. And it's so cool, because you can turn it on, and then you can also, and then what it does is that it changes from the D-pad to the analog stick, which I think is really, really cool. But just be careful with it, because not all games work with it. But a majority of the games that were released for the PlayStation in 1998 and onwards do work with this, and they actually do, and it usually does turn on the analog control, usually by default. And there are some pretty cool accessories that you can also get for your PlayStation 1. One of my favorites in particular, this arcade stick right here, the Askaware PS1 Fighting Arcade Stick. This was a third party. Obviously this was a third party arcade stick, but it was licensed by Sony at the time. It was. You can clearly see that it's a pretty complicated stick. like in the sense that it has like all these weird switches on here, and they actually do stuff on there. I can't remember exactly what they do, but I think they kind of act as like what, auto fire buttons or something like that. I can't remember, but just correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. But yeah, obviously you can see you have your little joystick right here. The joystick does work pretty well. You know, mine is a little bit looser, you know, because the little ball at the top of the stick is loose, but it still works. Like, it still works really good. And then you can obviously see your buttons, which are really huge. You know, they all sound and press very, very well. I mean, maybe not as good as some other fighting sticks that's out there, but for a PS1 Arcade Fighting Stick, this is one that I would definitely get for your collection, especially if you love fighting games. I mean, you could literally play Marvel vs. Capcom, you know, Street Fighter, Alpha 3, or Tekken. Like, they all work very well on this right here. You will literally have a fun time playing it. And that's just two of the accessories that I do own for the PlayStation 1. The other, obviously, being the multi-tap. Now, there are plenty of games. There are plenty of games for the PlayStation 1 that I do recommend. I do have over 50 PS1 games, so I'm not going to show all of them in this video. I can't explain them in like a little list, though. But I will show you some of my top favorite games for the system, though. I will show you that. At least some. Like I said, keep in mind that this is some of them. I have way more favorites than this. But I'm going to show you my ones that would possibly make it in a top 5 list. You know what I mean? So let's first start off with Ridge Racer Type 4. Ridge Racer Type 4 is an amazing racing game. Like, it's part of the series Ridge Racer, which, you know, if you guys have seen me play Ridge Racer, you guys probably already know that I highly praise this series for having an amazing, you know, driving system and a drifting system as well as an amazing soundtrack. This game in particular actually showcases the power of the PlayStation by utilizing a unique graphical technique called garage shading, which was a graphical technique that I talked about in my PlayStation versus Sega Saturn video, and be sure to check that video out if you guys haven't. But yeah, Ridge Racer Type 4 was one of the few games on the PlayStation 1 to really showcase how powerful it was in the 3D department. It's an amazing game. Like, it has the best soundtrack of all the Ridge Racer games, and graphically it's the best looking one on the PlayStation 1, and it's just the most fun. The drifting system in this one is actually pretty complicated. It does take time getting used to, but when you do, it's really fun, and I highly recommend this game hardcore. Now, another game that I will also recommend for this collection is that even though I do think that the Sega Saturn did handle 2D games better, there are a few 2D games on PlayStation that do play very well, and one in particular is probably my favorite 2D game on the console, at least that isn't Castlevania Symphony of the Night. But hey, we're not going to talk about that, okay? Listen, I'm not that kind of gamer. But anyway, so this game in particular is easily one of my favorite 2D games on this platform, and I think it's probably the best one that isn't Castlevania, and that is Megaman X4. Megaman X4 is easily one of the best Mega Man games of the series. Like, first of all, it has an amazing soundtrack, right? It seems like that seems to be like a theme here, is that a lot of the PS1 games have like an amazing soundtrack, which is what this game does, but also the graphics in it are really, really good. It literally gets to a point where I feel like I'm playing a Sega Saturn game, and even more coincidental is that Mega Man X4 was also released on the Saturn, but I do know that the PlayStation version is much more popular, and that's largely because of the popularity of the PlayStation. But Mega Man X4 just has an amazing gameplay. It still has that Mega Man feel and everything. Like, it's freaking Mega Man. That's the best way I can say it. The graphics are nice and colorful. It's very vibrant. The gameplay is awesome. It's a must-have for your console. And another one that I will mention is also one of my favorites is Rayman, which is a game that I do own in my collection, but I just don't have it in the stack to show you it, because like I said, I do own a lot of games, so I only picked my top favorites. Like, as much as I love Rayman, I love Mega Man X4 better, so that's another reason why. But speaking of platformers, in terms of 3D platforming games, this one might be my favorite, although I do think that the third game possibly tops this one. But I will still recommend this one because this is a great one to start off with, and that is Crash Bandicoot. Crash Bandicoot originally used to be the PlayStation mascot, but he was for a while, at least during the original trilogy, along with this and Crash Team Racing. However, over time, the rights to Crash, obviously, and reverted back to Universal, and then Universal started publishing Crash, in other places and stuff like that, like on other platforms and stuff. But before that, he was exclusive to the PlayStation, and this was during a time when guys like Sonic was the main mascot of Sega, Mario was obviously the main mascot of Nintendo, and at the time, Crash was the mascot of Sony. And Crash Bandicoot, specifically the first one in my opinion, is an amazing platforming game. But do beware that it's a very, very hard platformer. But then again, so was Rayman. But Crash Bandicoot in particular is a very, very hard game. So just be mindful of that. But it's an amazing game, and I do highly recommend it. But if I do have to say which Crash game tops this one, it would probably be Crash Bandicoot Warped, which is the third one. So, but at the same time, I would be damned if I didn't recommend the first one either, because the first one is a classic, and I highly recommend it. So, moving on to the next game in my collection, as far as my top favorites, is Twisted Metal 2. Twisted Metal 2 is a game where vehicular combat is basically at its absolute best. Like, this is exactly how vehicular combat should be done. You know what I mean? Like, out of all the main PlayStation series that exists out there, I'm actually amazed that Twisted Metal has never gotten another game in the series since the 2012 game that came out for the PlayStation 3. But this game in particular, Twisted Metal 2, just reminds me of how awesome the series is, and makes me wish that they would come back with another game, hopefully around the time when the PS5 comes out, but I'm not so sure about that though. And honestly, Twisted Metal 2 is just, I feel like it's the best vehicular combat game on the PlayStation. Now, I do know there were other ones that existed, like Road Trip, which was made by the same developers as Twisted Metal, ironically. But then there's also Vigilante 8, another awesome vehicular combat game, like another masterpiece of a vehicular combat game. But I would still say that Twisted Metal 2 is definitely the best vehicular combat game for the PlayStation 1. It literally is the best one. Even though the physics are really wild, that's what you should expect from a game like this. The graphics are really good, the soundtrack is amazing, the gameplay is superb, like you're just blowing up cars and everything. Like, it's a feast to the eye. I highly recommend it. Now, on to my definitely two of my favorites. I'm going to have to kind of really show just both of them. First, we'll just start off with this one, Tekken 2. Tekken 2 is probably one of the greatest sequels ever made, because not only was it an improvement on the first Tekken game, but they improved on the graphics, they gave the characters more distinct moves for their movesets and everything, and there's also all kinds of secret combos that you can learn and everything, and that's why I think this game in particular is awesome. I even said repeatedly on this channel that this was my very first video game I've ever made, and I remember that my dad had a copy of this game. One day he actually was pushing me and my brother to play it for the very first time when we were kids and all that stuff. He put it inside the PlayStation, and then he gave us both controllers and all that stuff. And I remember my first match with on that game very vividly. And I picked martial law, and my brother selected Lee Wulong, and we were just like mashing buttons the whole time. But it was so fun though. Like, I just remember that memory pretty vividly, because it was what this game, Tekken 2, is what made me become a gamer. This game in particular made me become a gamer, and that's why I praise this game more than most people do. Although, if I do have to say which game had the best gameplay, it would be its sequel, its successor, Tekken 3, which is a major time skip from Tekken 2. Need I remind you that it takes place just about 20 years later. Tekken 3 is not only the best Tekken game of the series in my opinion, but it's also one of the greatest fighting games and one of the greatest video games of all time. Like, it literally is right up there in the legendary status, along with games like Asteroids and Super Mario Brothers and Final Fantasy VI. Like, it literally is one of the greatest video games of all time. Like, the combat system is amazing, the graphics are awesome, the faster gameplay compared to Tekken 2. It's just amazing, and the soundtrack just only keeps getting better and better. Although I will admit that I do think Tekken 2 2 probably had the best soundtrack, possibly, but I would say Tekken 3 is second best. But in terms of gameplay, Tekken 3 easily blows the first two out of the water. Now, that's not to say that Tekken 2 is a bad game. Tekken 2 has amazing gameplay that still, I think, is addicting. But Tekken 3 just has a more realistic feel. And that's why I think most people love it a lot, because it just feels a lot more realistic, especially with the jumping, because it's not like you're jumping on the moon anymore. And that's also done to make the air combat much better. So overall, Tekken 3 is a game that I highly recommend that you play. Like, when you get a PS1, you have to make sure that Tekken 3 is literally in your cart along with it. You are not going to regret it at all. Now, on the other hand, there are other awesome games that are on here too. One in particular is one of my favorite horror games of all time, might even be my favorite horror game of all time, Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2 is just so amazing. Like, it's everything I expected to be for a survival horror game. Now, a lot of you people have probably seen me play the Resident Evil 2 remake, which I praised, and actually do admit, I do think it tops the original. I do think that the original still deserves all the praise that it gets, and I still can't live without the original, even though I do think that the remake arguably surpasses the the original. But the original still has that, it still has that claustrophobic feel, it still has that awesome soundtrack in it. The voice acting is obviously not the best. I mean, in the remake it's a lot better. And one of my reasons for praising the remake is that it had that survival horror atmosphere that the original had, and that's what this is. It has a very foreboding atmosphere that just keeps you tense throughout the whole game. Resident Evil 2 is also available on other consoles like the N64, for example, but I would say that the PlayStation port is definitely a lot better because of the controls. Like, the controls feel a lot better compared to the N64 version. The N64 version, on the other hand, I feel like is more just for the graphics and everything, because it is improved over the PS1 version, but but the PS1 version just plays better, in my opinion. So if there was any version of Resident Evil 2 I would get, it would be this one, and definitely have the original in your collection, because Resident Evil 2 is a must-have. Now, for the last one, I will say right now that these two are definitely some of the best games ever made, and these two continue to make me the gamer that I am today. And I'm going to be mentioning both of them, and that is Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy IX. Now, first, let's discuss Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII, in particular, is one of the best RPGs ever made. Like, even though I don't think it's the best RPG ever made, I still think it deserves the praise that it gets and everything. And it has an amazing soundtrack. It has amazing, the graphics are obviously dated, but the visuals look amazing. Like, especially when you're doing like certain attacks and all that stuff. Like, the visuals look awesome, even if the graphics are dated. It has lovable characters and an amazing storyline. So on the other hand, this game in particular is probably my favorite, tied along with 7 as far as my favorite Final Fantasy games, and that is Final Fantasy IX. Now, unlike the futuristic setting of Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy IX brought the series back to where it originally was, and that's the whole medieval royalty kind of type setting, where you have black mages and white mages all around and all that stuff, and the warriors and the thieves and everything. Like, it has that same classic character style set that the first Final Fantasy game had, which is why each character in this game has very unique attacks. Like, each character actually feels different, as opposed to Final Fantasy VII, where you can literally give each character the same kind of materials and all that stuff, but at the same time, each character's stats are still pretty different. Like, for example, strength, luck, vitality, and etc., etc. But what Final Fantasy IX did that was different from 7 is that it had characters like learn abilities and everything, and as I said before, each character has their own set of moves that they can do and everything, like a certain role that fits for the character class that they're classified as, that they're determined as. And that's why I love Final Fantasy IX. It just, like, I know this sounds similar, but it goes without saying, the soundtrack is just awesome, and the graphics, in my opinion, actually look way better than 7's, in my opinion. I mean, the graphics are still dated 20 years later, but I still think they look better than 7. And as I said before, it's just an awesome game. Like, it's so addicting. Definitely get it for your collection. These two games in particular are a must-have for your collection. Now, Final Fantasy VIII, I would still definitely love to have in your collection, but as far as a must-have and everything, it would definitely be these two. Final Fantasy VII and 9 are both the GOATs when it comes to the PlayStation 1. If you guys do wish to see the rest of my collection, make sure you guys go to the VG Select and go on the Shiz Network. It should be in the description below or even in the comment section, so that way you guys can check out the PlayStation collection that I have there. And maybe in a separate video I'll even show my collection and everything. So yeah, with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this very long review of the PlayStation 1. I knew it was going to be very long, to tell you the truth, because there's just a lot to say. If you guys did enjoy it, make sure you guys hit that subscribe button for more videos and everything. And I'll see you guys in the next video. This is your friendly neighborhood reptile, signing off.